Life is a journey filled with mountaintops and valleys. There are seasons of joy and seasons where the storms of life rage so fiercely that they leave us questioning, why is this happening to me? Where is God in all of this? Tonight, I want to share with you 8 powerful truths about trusting God's plan, especially when life feels deeply unfair. These truths are not just ideas, but keys to unlocking a blessed and abundant life, even in the midst of trials. God sees the bigger picture. Life often feels like a fragmented puzzle. Each piece on its own can seem confusing or even meaningless. When faced with heartbreak, rejection, or loss, we're tempted to believe that God isn't paying attention or doesn't care. But what if the pieces of our lives that appear chaotic are part of a larger divine masterpiece? Isaiah 55:8. 1 Timothy 8 verse 9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God is the master artist, and what we see as random brushstrokes, He sees as essential to the beauty of the whole painting. Think of Joseph in the Bible. At 17, he was betrayed by his own brothers and sold into slavery. Imagine the pain of knowing your family turned against you. Then, as a slave in Egypt, Joseph worked faithfully, only to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. Years passed. Alone, forgotten, and confined to a prison cell, Joseph could have easily concluded that God had abandoned him. But he didn't. Joseph didn't know that every twist and turn in his journey, the betrayal, the false accusations, the years in prison, were stepping stones to something far greater. When Pharaoh had a dream no one could interpret, Joseph was summoned from the prison to the palace. God had been preparing him all along for a role he couldn't have imagined. Joseph became second in command over all of Egypt and saved countless lives, including his own family, during a famine. Joseph's life teaches us that what feels like a detour is often God's way of leading us to our destiny. In our own lives, we face moments where the pain seems unbearable and the unfairness overwhelming. A mother loses her job while trying to provide for her children. A young man is passed over for promotion he worked tirelessly to earn. A family receives a heartbreaking medical diagnosis. In these moments, it's hard to see the purpose. But when we step back and trust God's hand, we realize that He sees the entire picture, the end from the beginning. A real-life example comes from a woman I once met who had been through a series of devastating setbacks. She lost her home in a natural disaster. Her marriage ended unexpectedly, and she battled a serious illness, all within 2 years. She told me, "For a while, I couldn't understand why God would allow this. But now, years later, I see how He used each trial to bring me closer to Him. I found a deeper faith, a new purpose, and even the strength to encourage others going through similar struggles." When life feels unfair, we must cling to the truth that God's perspective is infinitely greater than ours. Trusting His plan doesn't mean the pain will disappear instantly, but it does mean that we can find peace in knowing that our story is still being written. God's delays are not denials. Waiting is one of the hardest things to endure, especially when life feels unfair. We live in a culture that values speed and instant results. We want answers now, solutions today, and blessings yesterday. But God's timing operates on a different plane, one that is not bound by human deadlines or our desire for quick fixes. Ecclesiastes 3:11 reminds us, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Not in our time, but His time. God's delays are not His denials. They are often His way of preparing us for something far greater than we imagined. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, but years passed and Sarah remained barren. They waited and waited until they were well past the age of childbearing. Imagine the frustration, the doubt, and the questions they must have had. God, did you forget your promise? Did we hear you wrong? But God had not forgotten. At the appointed time, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. This pattern is seen repeatedly in Scripture. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he was called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. David was anointed king as a young shepherd boy, but had to wait years and endure many trials before he took the throne. Even Jesus waited 30 years before beginning his public ministry. God's delays are not arbitrary, they are intentional. In today's world, we struggle with waiting. A woman praying for a spouse wonders if God hears her. A man working tirelessly at his job questions why he hasn't received the promotion he deserves. A couple yearning for a child endures years of heartbreak with each passing month. In these moments, it's easy to feel like God's silence equals rejection. But silence is not absence, and delay is not denial. A woman I know shared her story of waiting on God. After losing her job unexpectedly, she spent months applying for positions with no success. She grew discouraged and questioned why God would allow her to struggle. But during that season, she developed new skills, deepened her faith, and discovered passions she didn't know she had. When she finally received a job offer, it was for a position that perfectly aligned with her calling and provided opportunities beyond her imagination. She told me if I had gotten one of those earlier jobs, I would have settled for less than God's best. When life feels unfair, it's tempting to take matters into our own hands. We want to force doors open instead of waiting for God to open the right one. But just as a fruit picked before its time is bitter, so are the blessings we try to force before God's appointed time. During the waiting, God is often doing his deepest work in us. He is refining our character, strengthening our faith, and aligning circumstances for our good. The delay may feel like a season of silence, but it is often a season of preparation. Trusting God's timing means surrendering our need for control and believing that his plans are far better than anything we could design for ourselves. In the delay, there is purpose. In the waiting, there is growth. And when the blessing finally comes, we realize it was worth every moment we spent trusting in him. Trials shape us, not break us. When hardship strikes, it feels like life is breaking us into pieces. But what if those very trials, the ones we pray to avoid, are God's way of shaping us into something stronger, something greater? Trials are not meant to destroy us, but to refine us. Think of gold. To reach its purest form, it must endure the fire. The heat is intense and the process is painful, but without it, the gold remains riddled with impurities. In the same way, our lives often require refining through the fires of adversity. Romans 5:03 says, "We also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." Consider the story of a potter working with clay. The potter molds, presses, and shapes the clay, but the process isn't finished until the piece is placed in the kiln, where it endures extreme heat. Without that heat, the clay remains fragile and unusable. God is the master potter, and we are his clay. The trials we face are his kiln. They strengthen us, prepare us, and make us vessels capable of carrying his purpose. Many of us have experienced seasons of life where the pressure feels unbearable. A business owner faces bankruptcy after years of pouring their heart into their company. A young woman endures the heartbreak of a failed relationship she believed was leading to marriage. A father struggles to hold his family together while battling his own doubts about God's plan. These moments hurt. They stretch us beyond what we think we can endure. But if we allow God to work through the pain, we come out stronger, wiser, and closer to him. I once met a man who shared his story of losing everything he thought defined him: his job, his reputation, and his sense of security. For months he wrestled with anger and self-doubt, asking God why his life had fallen apart. But as he pressed on, he realized that the loss had stripped away the things he had been relying on instead of God. Through the trial, his faith grew deeper, and he found a new calling that was more fulfilling than anything he had before. He said, "That season didn't break me, it built me." Trials also teach us empathy. When we walk through pain, we gain a deeper understanding of others' struggles. A woman who overcomes the pain of infertility becomes a source of comfort for others in the same situation. A man who battled addiction uses his story to inspire hope in others still in the fight. God doesn't waste our pain. It becomes a tool for healing, both in our lives and in the lives of those around us. When life feels unfair, we may be tempted to see our trials as punishment or signs of God's absence. But the truth is, those moments are evidence of His work in us. He is not breaking us down, He is building us up. Our faith, perseverance, and character are refined through challenges. Trust the process, even when it hurts, because God's purpose is always greater than our pain. God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Weakness is something we try to hide. In a world that celebrates strength, success, and independence, admitting weakness feels like failure. Yet, it is in our weakest moments that God's power shines the brightest. Paul writes in Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." These are not just words of comfort, they are a profound truth about the nature of God's strength. When we reach the end of ourselves, when our resources run dry, that's when God steps in and does what only He can do. Think about the story of Gideon in the Bible. Gideon was called by God to lead an army against the Midianites, a seemingly impossible task, but God didn't want Gideon to rely on his own strength or numbers. Instead, He reduced Gideon's army from 3,2,0,0 men to just 300. Why? So that when the victory came, it would be clear that it was God's doing, not man's. Gideon's weakness became the stage for God's power to be displayed. In our own lives, we often feel like Gideon, a single parent struggling to raise children on a limited income, wonders how they'll make it through another month. A student facing overwhelming challenges in school questions whether they're good enough. A person battling illness feels their strength slipping away. These are moments when we realize our limits, and that's when God shows up. There's a story of a man who lost everything, his job, his savings, and his home, during an economic downturn. At his lowest point, he had no choice but to rely completely on God. He prayed not just for provision, but for strength to get through each day. And God answered. Opportunities came unexpectedly, doors opened that he hadn't even knocked on, and he began to rebuild his life. Looking back, he said, "I thought I had lost everything, but what I really lost was my pride." And that allowed God to show me His strength. Weakness is not a curse, it's an invitation to experience God's grace. When we stop striving to do everything in our own power, we make room for God to work. A friend of mine once said, "I used to think I had to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. But when I finally admitted I couldn't, that's when God stepped in and carried me." The truth is, God's strength is not just sufficient, it is more than enough. It is in our darkest moments when we feel we have nothing left to give that His power is most evident. He takes what we see as weakness and turns it into an opportunity for His glory to be revealed. When life feels unfair and you feel inadequate, remember this: you were never meant to carry it all on your own. God's strength is waiting to meet you in your weakness. Surrender your pride, your fear, and your exhaustion to Him. Let Him show you what His grace can do. What seems like the end of your strength is the beginning of His. God uses what the enemy meant for evil for good life, often presents moments when it feels like everything is working against us. The betrayal of a trusted friend, an unforeseen tragedy, or a failure that leaves us questioning our worth can feel like the work of the enemy to destroy our faith and hope. While those experiences may bring pain, God has the power to take what the enemy meant for evil and turn it into something beautiful and redemptive. Genesis 50:20 captures this truth when Joseph, speaking to the brothers who betrayed him, says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's life was marked by injustice, sold into slavery by his own family, falsely accused and imprisoned. From a human perspective, his story seemed hopeless. Yet God was writing a greater narrative, one that turned Joseph's trials into tools for his destiny. Consider the real-life stories of people who have turned their pain into purpose. There's the young man who grew up in poverty, surrounded by violence, and later went on to start an organization that provides mentorship and resources for at-risk youth. Or the woman who survived an abusive relationship and now advocates for domestic violence survivors, offering hope and healing to those still in the fight. These are modern-day examples of God's promise to redeem what the enemy intended to destroy. When tragedy strikes, it's natural to ask, why me? A person battling a life-threatening illness or a family grieving the loss of a loved one may feel like their world is falling apart. But God's promise is that He will use even these dark moments for good. One powerful example is the story of Nick Vujicic, born without arms or legs. What could have been a life filled with despair has instead become a testimony of God's transformative power. Nick has inspired millions with his faith, reminding the world that God can take what seems like a disadvantage and use it for His glory. In our pain, God often plants the seeds of purpose. A couple who struggled with infertility for years began fostering children in need, creating a family and a legacy that has impacted countless lives. Their pain didn't define them, it propelled them into a mission they hadn't imagined. When life feels unfair and the enemy's attacks seem relentless, we have two choices: to believe the lie that we are defeated, or to trust that God will redeem even the darkest moments for His good purposes. God doesn't just mend what's broken, He transforms it into something new and greater than we could have envisioned. We often yearn for big blessings, dramatic changes, or monumental moments of breakthrough. But what we sometimes overlook is the power of faithfulness in the small, everyday things. God calls us to trust and obey Him in the little moments before He entrusts us with the larger ones. Luke 16:10 says, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." This principle speaks to the importance of staying committed even when the task at hand feels insignificant or unrecognized. Think about David, the shepherd boy. Before he ever faced Goliath, he spent years faithfully tending sheep in the fields. It may have seemed like an unimportant task, but during those years, David learned to protect his flock from lions and bears. His faithfulness in the fields prepared him for the moment God called him to fight the giant. In our lives, it's easy to dismiss the small things. A teacher grading papers late into the night might feel like her efforts go unnoticed. A young father working 2 jobs to provide for his family might wonder if it's worth the sacrifice. A student volunteering at a soup kitchen might question if their service truly makes a difference. These small acts of faithfulness, though often unseen by others, are seen and honored by God. Real-life examples abound of people whose small, consistent efforts led to greater blessings. A man who spent years mentoring a handful of teenagers in his community later saw one of them become a leader who impacted thousands. A woman who quietly cared for elderly neighbors inspired an entire neighborhood to come together in acts of kindness. Faithfulness isn't always glamorous, but it is powerful. Sometimes the small things God calls us to do are not just about preparing us for something bigger, they are the very foundation of His plan. When Jesus performed the miracle of feeding the 5,000, He started with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Someone had to bring that small offering before God could multiply it into something miraculous. Faithfulness in small things also builds trust. When we are diligent in the small responsibilities God gives us, we demonstrate that we are ready for greater blessings. A young woman I know spent years working in a low-level position at a nonprofit organization. She poured her heart into the work, even when it seemed like no one noticed. Over time, her dedication and integrity led to opportunities she never expected, including a leadership role that allowed her to expand the organization's impact on a global scale. She told me, if I hadn't been faithful in the small things, I would have missed God's bigger plan. Even when it feels like your efforts are invisible, remember that God sees your faithfulness. Each small act of obedience, every quiet moment of service, and each step of perseverance is shaping you for the greater blessings He has in store. Trust that God is working through your faithfulness, preparing you for something beyond what you can imagine. God's timing is perfect even when it feels delayed. There are seasons in life when waiting on God feels unbearable. Prayers seem unanswered. Dreams are put on hold. And we wonder if God has forgotten us. In those moments, it's easy to grow discouraged, to question His plan and timing, but the truth is, God's timing is never early, never late. It is always perfect. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. While this verse offers comfort, it also requires trust. Trust that God sees the full picture when we can only see fragments. He knows what we need and when we need it. Sometimes the delays we experience are not denials, but divine preparation. Think about Abraham and Sarah, who waited decades for the fulfillment of God's promise to give them a child. By human standards, it seemed impossible as their age advanced. They doubted, they questioned, and even tried to take matters into their own hands. Yet God remained faithful to His word, and in His perfect timing, Isaac was born. Their story is a reminder that what may seem like a delay to us is often God working behind the scenes to orchestrate His plan. In our own lives, waiting can be excruciating. A young woman praying for her future spouse may feel forgotten as friends around her get married. A family struggling financially might wonder why their breakthrough hasn't come. A person battling illness might question why healing hasn't arrived. These are real, raw experiences of waiting that test our faith. One man shared his story of waiting years for a promotion at his job. Each time he applied, the position went to someone else, and he began to feel invisible. He wrestled with frustration and disappointment, but he remained faithful where he was, trusting God's timing. When the promotion finally came, it was not only to the position he had desired, but to one with greater responsibilities and rewards than he had ever imagined. He said, if it had come any sooner, I wouldn't have been ready for it. God's timing wasn't just good, it was perfect. Waiting often reveals what's in our hearts. It teaches us patience, dependence on God, and humility. It refines us, stripping away our sense of control and deepening our trust in His provision. Consider a farmer who plants seeds in the soil. He doesn't see the harvest immediately. There's a period of waiting, watering the soil, ensuring the conditions are right before the growth becomes visible. Our lives are like that soil. God plants seeds of promise, but we must wait for the right season for them to bear fruit. During these waiting periods, God is not inactive. He is preparing us for the blessings ahead. Think about Joseph, who waited in prison for years before stepping into his destiny as a leader in Egypt. Every day in the prison was preparation for his eventual role. What felt like a delay was actually God building his character and preparing him to handle the responsibility of his future. Trusting God's timing means surrendering our own timelines and embracing His. It's hard, but it's worth it. While we wait, He strengthens us, teaches us, and aligns us with His perfect. The delays we face are often God's way of ensuring that when His blessings come, we are ready to receive and steward them well. God's blessings are often tied to our obedience. When we align our hearts and actions with His plan, we position ourselves to receive the fullness of His promises. Obedience is not always easy. It requires trust, faith, and often sacrifice. But it is the pathway to a truly blessed life. Deuteronomy 28:01 says, "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all His commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God." This passage highlights a powerful truth: obedience brings blessing. Obedience to God often calls us to step outside of our comfort zones. Think of Noah, who was instructed by God to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. His obedience not only saved his family, but became a testament to God's faithfulness. What if Noah had doubted, hesitated, or refused to act? His obedience unlocked the blessing of protection and preservation. In our modern lives, obedience can look like choosing integrity in a culture that values shortcuts. It can mean walking away from relationships or opportunities that pull us away from God's purpose. It might involve forgiving someone who hurt us deeply or giving generously when we're barely making ends meet. These acts of obedience may not make sense to the world, but they make sense in God's kingdom. I know a woman who felt called to leave her high-paying corporate job to start a nonprofit serving underserved communities. It was a leap of faith. She faced financial uncertainty and criticism from those who didn't understand her decision. But she obeyed God's call, and through her obedience, she has impacted countless lives. She often says, "The blessings that have come from following God's plan far outweigh any sacrifice I made." Obedience also involves trusting God in the areas we cannot control. A young couple struggling with infertility chose to obey God's call to trust Him, even when every doctor told them their chances were slim. They prayed, waited, and remained faithful. Today they share their story of how God blessed them, not only with biological children, but also through the adoption of a child who became the greatest joy of their lives. Their obedience to trust God's plan, even in uncertainty, led to a double portion of blessing. Obedience requires surrendering our will to His. It's saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." This kind of surrender isn't passive. It's active faith in action. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland, Abraham obeyed, even though he didn't know where he was going. His obedience paved the way for blessings that would extend to generations. The blessings that flow from obedience aren't always material. Sometimes the greatest blessings are peace in the midst of chaos, joy that transcends circumstances, or the deep satisfaction of knowing we are walking in God's will. Obedience doesn't mean life will be free of challenges, but it does mean we will experience God's presence and provision in ways we never imagined. God's plan is perfect, and when we choose to obey, we step into a life that is abundantly blessed, not because we deserve it, but because His grace is sufficient. Obedience is the key that unlocks the door to His promises. It aligns our hearts with His and allows His blessings to flow in and through our lives. As we reflect on the journey of trusting God's plan when life seems unfair, it becomes clear that His ways are higher than ours. Though we may not always understand the why in the moment, we can rest assured that God is weaving a tapestry far greater than we can imagine. Every trial, every delay, every act of obedience is part of His divine purpose for our lives. Life's unfairness is not a sign of God's absence. It's an opportunity for His power to be revealed. When we surrender to His timing, trust in His goodness, and remain faithful in both the small and the challenging moments, we position ourselves to receive the blessings He has prepared for us. Let us remember that God is a redeemer. He takes what the enemy meant for harm and turns it into good. He makes beauty out of ashes and joy out of mourning. His timing is perfect, His plan is flawless, and His love for us is unshakable. So as we face the storms of life, let us hold tightly to the truth that trusting in God's plan is the key to a blessed life. It's not about avoiding trials, it's about allowing Him to use those trials to shape us, to refine us, and to bring us into the fullness of His purpose. Be encouraged today. Your waiting is not wasted. Your obedience is not in vain, and your faithfulness will bear fruit in due season. Trust in God's plan, for He is working all things together for your good and His glory. Keep pressing forward, not because life is always fair, but because God is always faithful. He has a purpose for your pain, a reason for your waiting, and a reward for your obedience. Trust Him, and you will see the blessings unfold in ways you never imagined.